Hello, friends. It's a pleasure to be here for a few observations on the Brazilian economy at the moment. Well, our government was a victory after 30 years of social democratic governance. It was a political victory of an alliance of conservatives and liberal Democrats. So, after 30 years of social democrats, for the first time in the recent history of Brazil, we have a political association of conservatives and liberal Democrats. And our diagnostic about the Brazilian economy was pretty straightforward. During the military regime, especially on the last two presidents under the military regime, which was a rightist regime, there was a huge increase on state participation of the economy. So state companies, Eletrobras, Petrobras, Sidebras, Portobras, Nucleabras, a huge economic arrangement of a centrally planned economy began driving growth rhythm of the economy. And the fact is that as we began more and more relying on centrally planned economy, the economy began underperforming. So after some reasonable growth that was around 6-7%, which was, as a matter of fact, Brazilian average for 2, 3, 4 decades in the last century. So Brazil had a very strong internal growth dynamics for 20, 30, 40 years. And then the military at the end began forcing their hand into a centrally planned economy. And we began to lose our growth dynamics. And when the democratization occurred in the middle of the 80s, it was social democrats that took power. So Brazil came from a rightist regime relying on centrally planned economy to democratic regime that performed our glasnost but not our perestroika. So we still kept relying on state planning, on a dirigist economy, a state-driven economy. And then for the last 40 years, 10 years of the military, last years of the military regime, and then 30 years of the social democrats, we could not make the transition to a market-driven economy. So we had all the symptoms of excess in public expenditures. Still during the military, a succession of exchange rate crisis. Then when the military were leaving and re-democratizing the country, we went to 200% inflation. The civil government came, and then we went to a hyperinflation, 5,000% a year. And then all the misfunctioning, a second burst of 2,000% hyperinflation in mid-90s. And price controls, low growth, and even as we fought inflation, eventually successfully, at the beginning of this century, we still had all the symptoms of a misfunctioning of an economic system with excess of public expenditures. So we have very high taxes, very high interest rates, overvalued exchange rate, and Brazil lost gradually its growth dynamics. So Brazil was once attracting people from all over the world, growing 2, 3, 4 decades at 7%, 7.3%, more than China, South Korea, more than Japan, and attracting people from all over the world. The largest Japanese colony outside of Japan, the largest, second largest Italian colony out of Italy, the third largest colony of German immigrants out of Germany. So Brazil used to grow very fast under a market system. And then the military, the second two of the most important military presidents, statized the economy. And the civilians, when they came, social democrats, kept a state-driven economic system. And these public expenditures came from 18% of GDP in the last 40 years, in the last 4 decades. We moved from 18% of GDP to 45% of GDP. So not only the government spent too much, but it spent unwisely, because most of the expenditures, the first largest expenditures was Social Security privileges for higher income people. Second largest, interest payments. Brazil became hell to entrepreneurs and heaven for rentists, people who lend money to a drunk government, borrowing in a snowball indebtedness process. And the third largest one was exactly the wage bill. Public employees receiving wages 2, 3, 4 times the compatible or the comparable of what they would receive if they were working in the private sector. So our diagnosis was very clear when we moved them. First, a social security reform. So in 2019, we performed a very, very broad social security reform, removing the privileges, and we shaved more than $150 billion for the next 10 years of public spending. So around 800 billion reales, so more than $150 billion in 10 years, shaved through a very important social security reform. Remember that in 2019, people were in the streets of France against the social security reform. And people were in the streets of Brazil in favor of a social security reform, giving an enormous demonstration of maturity of the public opinion and support of our reforms. And then the Congress approved their reforms. So in the first year, we began attacking the major source of uncontrollable public spending. The second one, we divested another $30 billion of state companies, subsidiaries, and at the same time, we deleveraged public banks, paying back their debts to the union on another $30 billion. And with that, we knocked down the debt GDP ratio from 76.5 to 78 to 75.8. So in the very first year of our government, we disarmed the snowball indebtedness process. We knocked down from 76.5 to 75.8 the debt GDP ratio. And then there was a collapse in domestic interest rates, because for the very first time, we changed the policy mix. We moved from an easy fiscal and tight money policy to a tight fiscal policy with a lower interest rate and a higher exchange rate. So we corrected a chronic problem in Brazil, which was the overvalued exchange rate, because the government was in a snowball indebtedness process, paying very high interest rates and feeding an arbitrage movement. People would borrow money abroad to lend to the Brazilian government here with very high interest rates and an overvalued exchange rate. So we changed those two critical prices. And third, we went for the very first time for a freezing of public wages for 3 years in a row. It never happened before in Brazil. For 3 years, we've frozen public wage increases so that we shaped another, with an administrative reform that we sent to the Congress, We have frozen the wages in the public sector, and at the same time we sent an administrative reform, and the compound effect of these two measures was shaving another 550 billion reales, which means around $70 billion in the next 10 years also of future expenditures. So we broke the explosive dynamics of public expenditures. And we shaved another 400 billion reales, which is around $80 billion from next 4 years of interest payments on internal debt. So in the very first year, we cut them down by 80 billion. Second year, which is 2020, we cut them down by 120 billion. And we estimate that another 100 billion every year were shaved out of these dynamics, explosive dynamics of interest rate payments on internal debt, because we knocked down the debt GDP ratio. So we were, at the same time, we settled a sequence of international agreements. First with Mercosur, it was paralyzed for the last 8 years. Second, with the European Union, it was paralyzed since the Doha round 20 years ago. Then with EFTA, European Free Trade Area. And now we are talking to South Korea, to Japan, to the US. So we are also opening the Brazilian economy. One of the 10 largest economies in the world, but one of 100 most closed economies in the world. Brazil is 130 in degree of openness. So we decided to open the Brazilian economy. And when we were performing these structural reforms and fulfilling this agenda of structural reforms, we were knocked by the pandemics. The pandemics hit Brazil in March of this year, and we switched from the agenda of structural reforms to emergency measures. 180 degrees. We loosened up the fiscal policy. We eased up even more the monetary policy, the credit policy, and we spent a little more than 8% of GDP attacking the disease, the COVID-19. We decentralized resources to state and municipalities. We transferred funds to the decentralized health services of Brazil. We have a very well working, decentralized health service system. At the same time, as we were fighting to save lives, we at the same time launched a sequence of measures to preserve jobs and companies. We digitalized 64 million Brazilians, 26 million were receiving social assistance, and another 38 million were in the informal job markets. People who go down the streets offering their services, people who clean houses, people who fix gardens. So informal market in Brazil, huge, 38 million invisible workers. So we launched layers of protection to these people. Grants, monthly grants, we approved the monthly grants to 64 million Brazilians. Around $120 to every individual. So we digitalized this 64 million Brazilians, invisible Brazilians, and we offered them layers of protection with an auxiliary grant. As a matter of fact, with the dollar at 5 now, it's even more than that. It's around $160. Monthly payments, $160 to every one of the 64 million digitalized Brazilians. And we transferred this money till the end of this year. So we began with this $160, and now in the last 3 months, we cut them by half to $80 a month. So we are phasing out this emergency grant to protect the invisible worker, because the economy is bouncing back in V. Just to give you an idea, we also launched job protections programs, job protection programs that preserve 11 million jobs, which is 1/3 of the formal labor market in Brazil. What is the final result? Is that we will probably reach the end of the year, most probably losing 0 jobs in the formal market. Because in the last 4 months, we created 1 million jobs. We lost 1.2 million jobs in the formal market in the first 3 months of the pandemic. March, April, May. June was balanced. And then July, we created 100,000 jobs. August, we created 250,000 jobs. September, we created 313,000 jobs. In October, around 400,000. So we created 1 million jobs in only 4 months, and Brazil displayed a V-shaped recovery, a strong V-shaped recovery. So that if we generate only 200,000 jobs in the next 2 months, which is certainly will do, the net effect at the end of the year will be 0 loss of jobs in the formal markets. So this was due to our job protection programs that worked wonderfully, wonderfully. So we have the identification, the ID of each one of these 11 million workers that had preserved their jobs through an agreement. We flexibilized wage agreements and we supplemented their wages. So the company, instead of firing the worker, they would keep the worker, pay only half of the wage, and we would supplement the wage so that the company could preserve the job and not fire the worker. So the system worked reasonably well. Brazil is growing last quarter over the quarter before 7.7%. So a consumption of oil, consumption of electricity, tax revenues, everything is flying 2 digits. Credit is expanding 2 digits, and Brazil bounced back strongly. Now, from now to the end of the year, the idea is that on 31 December, we get back to ordinary business. So we phased out, by the end of the year, we will have phased out these auxiliary layers that we launched to preserve jobs and lives in the economy. People are returning to their jobs. The disease made a bounce back, but we still cannot say that it is a second wave. As of now, we are concentrated in exactly providing vaccines. We will be probably announcing a vaccination, a mass vaccination plan in the near future, and we will be examining. But as the economy bounces back and people return safely to their jobs, keeping the protocols that allow them to test, first to vaccine, then to test, and then to treat if they are contaminated. But we are back to our agenda of structural reform. just to finalize a few words, our structural agenda of reforms is following on. During the pandemics, the Senate approved the independent central bank so that the transitory increases in prices of food do not become a generalized price increase, because we really increased the income of low-income people during the pandemics, so that they could preserve their lives, staying at social distance. And these people, of course, they consume 100% of this help. And so the prices of food, prices of even construction, because they improved their homes. Poor people use this additional income that they receive to improve their homes, to expand their homes. So prices of construction, prices of food went up, and we approved at the Senate the independent central bank so that sector prices, transitory increase of price, do not become generalized price increases and inflation. So our independent central bank, which is a dream that most of us well-trained economists had a dream of for 40 years, 30, 40 years, we have been defending the independence of the central bank. Now the Senate just approved it. And more than that, we are deregulating gas, natural gas, oil, electric sector, cabotage, logistics, and we are changing all the regulatory mark so that this cyclical recovery based on consumption becomes, in 2021, sustainable growth fed by investment. So the big challenge ahead in 2021 is to transform a cyclical recovery as an effect of successful counter-cyclical policy against the impact of the pandemics. We have to transform this counter-cyclical policy into sustainable growth, accelerating our reforms. So we will accelerate privatization. We will accelerate private investments. We are selling infrastructure. Brazil has the largest investment frontier in the world now. We are selling more than 30 airports. We are selling state companies. We will be selling and authorizing railroads, infrastructure in general. We know that the future is green, and we know that the future is digital. So we digitalized these 64 poor Brazilians. At the same time, we created the largest digital bank in the world. We digitalized 100 million Brazilians, not only the 64 that received the help, but another 34 in one of the public banks that transferred money to poor people. And now we are going to make an IPO of this largest digital bank in the world. And this will be used to reduce the debt GDP ratio. So we are back to our agenda of reforms. We are restoring our contacts abroad because Brazil will accelerate its integration to global value chains. So for 30, 40 years, Brazil remained a closed economy, one of the closest economies in the world. We are determined to open the economy. So we will engage in these agreements. We now, just right now, apply to access to OECD. We need help in this effort to build a green and digital future. And the help is opening up for foreign investment. So we are opening up for foreign investments, and we are recovering our growth dynamics internally too. So we are relatively optimistic about the future. We think that Brazil will move faster than most economies in the near future. And we remain probably the largest investment frontier and most profitable investment frontier for the next decade. So thank you very much for your attention. Hope to see you soon, probably investing in Brazil. And make no mistake, I said in the first year at Davos that we would surprise the world, and we performed the Social Security reform went advanced economies have problem in performing it. And again, during the pandemics, I said again that Brazilian democracy would surprise the world because it is a very noisy democracy, but it does deliver. It does perform. It was never at risk. It's just that liberals and conservatives displaced social democrats. And they're making a lot of noise. But we understand that there's no problem, and the economy is bouncing back. Brazil is getting back its growth dynamics. You will be always hearing noise, but you just check the data. Just keep checking the data. The stock market is booming. Interest rates collapsed, and they are now solid single digit. The dollar, foreign exchange, made an overshooting, first because we changed our policy mix, so quite natural. Instead of very high interest rates and overvalued currency, we now have low interest rates, and we had an overshooting. And the overshooting escalated in the midst of the pandemics. But it happened already, and it's after going to 580, 590 against the dollar, it now collapsed. After the overshooting, this is quite natural. It now collapsed and is around 5. So it dropped substantially in recognition for our agenda of structural reforms. Thank you very much, friends. Has been a pleasure. Take care of your health and pay attention to Brazil, which has now the largest investment frontier in the world. Thank you.